You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C. And today I'm joined by a guest that should be familiar to some of our listeners and longtime subscribers. Returning to the show today is Abhigyan Rej, the Director of Research at Diplomat Risk Intelligence. Abhi, how's it going today?
Great. Thank you, Ankit, for having me on your show.
It's my pleasure to have you back. And we're going to talk today about a recent product that Abhi has been overseeing at Diplomat Risk Intelligence. But Abhi, before we get into today's discussion, which will focus on the Indian economy, which is the subject of this latest report, I thought it might be useful for you to just tell our listeners a little bit about what exactly Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI, as it's known for short, actually does. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to there.
So, the way, Ankit, we are imagining DRI is as eventually we'd like to see it grow up to be the leading risk intelligence firm that focuses on the Asia Pacific using bespoke research methodologies, both qualitative and quantitative. And while we are focusing on geopolitics and associated subjects such as economics, we also look at emerging technologies, which is an area of focus at DRI. We also look at innovative quantitative methods, which is something that we would also like to look at, and just generally provide solutions to businesses, nonprofits, and governments to act on tomorrow's challenges today. So actionable intelligence, bespoke methodologies, through reports, client briefings, and also some multimedia products that are in the pipeline.
Excellent. Great. And I think our listeners will get a good idea of the kind of work that DRI is capable of outputting over the course of today's discussion. So, Abhi, you recently oversaw this new report from DRI focusing on the state of India's economy, and particularly what the recovery, or the lack thereof, so to speak, from the current crisis in India, the economic crisis related to the measures taken in India to contain COVID-19, what that's going to look like. So the report's called Comorbid India's Economy and the Pandemic. It's available. It's out now, and it's available on the Diplomat Risk Intelligence website. I'll link to it in the show notes. But Abhi, let's take a step back and take stock of the big picture here. So India's economy really has been hit hard, as so many economies across the Asia Pacific region and across the world had been over the last year. According to the recent official Indian government data, the Indian economy contracted by 7.3% in the 2020-2021 financial year. And that was actually before a lot of that contraction actually occurred before India's devastating COVID-19 second wave, which has now is beginning to stabilize, but certainly I think all of our listeners will be well aware of the situation in the country, especially in May 2021. Further data, the Indian economy grew at an annualized rate of around just 1.6% in the period between January and March earlier this year, the first quarter of the year. And that's according again to GOI figures released at the end of May. But let's take a look at the bigger picture here, Abhi. I mean, India's economic performance, I think, is a question that is fundamentally carries quite a bit of geopolitical importance inherently. India has long been seen as sort of the Asian giant, the democratic counterweight in many ways to a rising China. And it doesn't matter what India chooses to do with its foreign policy, with its military procurement, investments, activity around the world, its energetic diplomacy. At the end of the day, the economic performance of the Indian economy, I think, really will seep into all of these issues. It will affect how countries, adversaries, and friends of India alike see the country and see its role in the Asia-Pacific region. So tell us a little bit about your top-line findings over the course of this DRI report. What is the broader outlook for the Indian economy in the near term?
So, Ankit, as you pointed out, the big picture is bleak, right? So, as one analysis shows that even if the Indian economy grew between financial year 2021 and 2022 by, say, another 7%, right? The net growth between financial years 20 and 22 will still be zero, right? So basically, it will take us 2 years to be where we were 2 years ago. And this is assuming, I mean, that this growth happens, that sort of cancels out the contraction that you mentioned. Um, so overall, clearly the situation is very bad. What is interesting is over the course of preparing this report, we had talked to eight very prominent Indian economists, including a former chief economic advisor, including a former chairman of an Indian bank, and so on and so forth. And uniformly, the picture that emerged from these discussions were that the pandemic has basically added to existing problems. So the Indian economy was already under severe stress even before the pandemic hit, right? So you have problems with growth. Obviously, that's something that happened. You had several policy decisions that were made by the Modi government that added quite a bit of stress to the Indian economy, including a 2016 decision to scrape 86% of Indian currency. You had a delayed introduction of a goods and services tax, which had a lot of like teething problems, which added to stress to small businesses. You had problems with in India's banking sector, right? So which was saddled with a lot of non-performing assets, bad loans, some of it because of infrastructure lending. So all of this was in the backdrop. Okay, and another important thing is that you had a huge employment crisis also, and a lot of questions. On top of everything, a lot of questions about official Indian numbers. So these things existed. These were the comorbidities, as one expert put it, and that's the title of our report. And what the pandemic has done is that it has contributed, it has deepened these problems, it has added a fresh layer of questions, fresh layer of concerns on top of this. So just to give you one example of what these concerns are, one concern here is that the pandemic could contribute to a fresh wave of bankruptcies, which will saddle India's banking sector with yet another layer of bad loans, and this is a shock that could be transmitted from lending to micro, small, and medium enterprises, and then if they are unable to pay because of the second wave, that will saddle the banking sector.
Right.
Employment, we expect the employment crisis to become a lot worse, and it was already very bad. So the top line picture here is comorbidities, right? So you already had problems with the Indian economy long before even the first wave of the pandemic hit, and this is just going to make things a lot worse.
Right, right. No, I think you put it quite well, and obviously this has sort of all sorts of follow-on effects for Indian society and the way in which India really, I mean, the self-perception of ordinary Indians for one, right? I mean, we've seen really hundreds of thousands, millions even of Indians fall out of the middle class as a result of the pandemic, which has, I think, longer term implications for the country's fortunes in general. But you brought up a good point, which was that India was already facing economic headwinds well before the pandemic. Since around 2018 or so, the economic narrative really began to turn, and you pointed to earlier decisions by the Modi government as early as 2016, the demonetization decision in November 2016, and so forth. But what was interesting is that India, being a large major economy, a large emerging economy, has sort of faced those headwinds also from certain external factors, right? Falling global commodity prices, decline in international trade, the rivalry between the U.S. and China in some ways intensifying, which was a double-edged sword for New Delhi in some ways, benefited it and cost India quite a bit as well. And finally, the decrease in manufacturing output across the developed world. So if we sort of flip that logic, take into account that headwinds for economies like India, large emerging economies, can come from external sources. When we sort of think about the recovery from COVID-19 economically on sort of a global level, what are do you see sort of certain places in which where if you are an investor or a business person looking for some sliver of good news about the Indian economy, are there certain reasons to be optimistic just given what's happening outside in the world? And obviously, there's lots of factors here, including vaccine inequality, adoption, the adoption of vaccinations more broadly. But when you think about the recovery, so to speak, and sort of external factors, what's your take on the Indian economy there?
So You mentioned foreign investors looking for good news or bad news, or in general trying to gauge what's going on with the Indian economy. The interesting thing is that if you look at the foreign direct investment numbers, right, they remain robust. So we have not seen much impact on foreign direct investment. The uniform outlook, again, this was a point of consensus among the experts that we spoke to for the report, was that foreign investment, direct investment, will continue to come in. So, and specifically, they identified a few sectors. Right? So they said pharma would be where foreign investors would do very well to invest, because India still, despite all the news about India's vaccine capabilities and whether or whether the country can deliver on the vaccination front, pharma sector remains very strong. So that was one area that people said was a bright spot. I think the overall direction of the Indian economy would be something to watch. And this is beyond the issues that we just identified, existing problems, then of course COVID-19. You see, something also on top of everything is happening with the economy, which is that almost exactly 30 years ago, India embarked on a very ambitious economic liberalization program, right? Rising out of a balance of payments crisis that happened in following the Gulf War and the end of the Cold War. And so there was a consensus in India, political consensus, that liberalization is good, liberal economic regimes are good, international trade is good. And what you've seen again, and this is something that predates the pandemic by a few months, but especially something that Mr. Modi has spoken about following the pandemic, which is that consensus around liberal economic regimes have now been brought to question. So when the Prime Minister speaks about an Atmanirbhar Bharat, or a self-reliant India, what essentially some people read that to be is some form of an return to economic autarky, which was India's mainstay till 1991. So if you go beyond all the issues with numbers, with growth numbers, or stress on banks, etc., and you ask yourself a very big question as to what kind of an economy India wants to become. There is a rethink there in official circles, whether, for example, whether international trade fundamentally is good or not. So when Modi speaks about Atmanirbhar Bharat, he says we are going to export, but we're going to cut down on imports. Right now, that India, for the longest time, before the country liberalized its economy in 1991, import substitution was a big economic mantra. Are we, when Modi then speaks of Atmanirbhar Bharat, are we looking at a return to such regimes? That remains to be seen.
Okay, great. So, Abhi, I mean, before we break, because we are coming to the end of our time here, I did want to ask you about one particular tool in sort of the Indian government's quiver, which is monetary policy, which has had a very kind of mixed record in India in terms of supporting growth. And in the report you observed that monetary policy as a tool for India can only really serve a very limited role here. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So what has happened in terms of how the Indian government has responded to the pandemic is both basically through monetary tools, right? So in terms of actual fiscal support, fiscal tools being used, experts have said that India could have done a lot more, but. And if also there's this obvious optics of seeing the Reserve Bank of India, for example, playing a frontline role or in managing the pandemic. So a large number of policy announcements that have been made about how to combat the pandemic has come from the RBI governor. So there is that accent on monetary policy as a way to manage the pandemic, as opposed to fiscal tools. But again, can you spend yourself out of a crisis in that can you print money rather than spending yourself out of a crisis? Can you just print money to pull yourself out of crisis? This is something you've seen in the US, right? You've seen the United States do this. India has tried to do it, but then there are other concerns, right? So one concern obviously with that is inflation. Also, one expert who pointed out to us that uh, you could see a scenario where inflation is very high and unemployment is also very high, and which leads us to this classic stagflation type of scenario that raises new risks. So yeah, monetary policy has been on the front line. Is it a great thing? What are the second and third and higher order effects of monetary tools, adverse effects of using monetary tools to combat the crisis remains to be seen.
Great. Well, Abhi, before we close out, is there anything else you'd like to emphasize insofar as the top line findings of the report go?
I think one thing that we didn't talk much about, and I think this was an important issue, was what does this pandemic mean for lives and livelihoods? Because I mentioned right in the beginning of the discussion that India's employment figures, or rather unemployment figures, were already very high, and there was a lot of controversy about the quality of data. And there was, if you remember, there was a leaked report from the government statistical office around fresh unemployment figures, which the government then sort of negated. Because if you have a situation where India is not generating enough jobs, right? India's so-called demographic dividend gets called to question. And then that itself, if you have a large population of unemployed young, who are then perhaps driven to sectarian causes, driven to criminal activities because of lack of job opportunities, then that creates an internal security concern.
Right. Yeah. The internal. Yeah. Exactly. And I think that kind of blowback is something that is certainly something that we should remain cognizant of in this context. Abhi, I want to thank you for coming on today to talk about this new report from Diplomat Risk Intelligence. Thanks so much for taking the time to come on today.
Thank you, Ankit.
Great. For listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, you can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your shows. We really do appreciate that. It helps the show grow quite a bit. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'll be back soon with more.